episode, we hear from Erina Driscoll, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Regis College. Mary was UCEA President from 1999 to 2000. Mary's distinguished career as an educator has featured many roles in a variety of institutions across the PK20 context. She has served as a music teacher, professor, department chair, and dean. She now serves in the highest levels of higher education administration, leading the academic growth and identity of her institution. Across this diverse body of experiencing, forefronting community and bridging multiple perspectives has remained at the center of her leadership work. How has the relationship between higher education and PK-12 leadership shifted over time? Where might that relationship head in the future, and what role might UCEA play? Listen here to find out. Welcome, Mary. It is so nice to see you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Oh, of course.
It's lovely to see you.
I could go on and on, I'm sure. But it has been a minute since we've talked, so I'm really grateful for this opportunity to sort of pick your brain and hear more about the relationship of the work that you've done in the past and what you're doing now.
Sure.
Let's just sort of jump in. And, you know, from this short introduction, we know that community has been a central theme throughout your academic career. Your dissertation was titled Schools as Community. So what experiences drew you towards centering community, and how do these ideas continue to impact your work now?
It's interesting. I used to tell this story about my dissertation when I was teaching doctoral students, especially who were at the point of formulating their questions, their research questions. I came to Chicago just as the report on public and private high schools came out that had been authored by Jim Coleman, the mathematical sociologist.
Yep.
And he had a finding that was quite controversial, that in high schools, when you compared public, private, and Catholic high schools, that Catholic high schools, students, minority students and students with relatively less affluent students did better in Catholic schools. And this was, it played into the Reagan administration privatization agenda. It really sent a lot of ripples through the universe. And one of the things that was interesting about the book, and I had a chance to work with Coleman, he was an absolutely wonderful individual, very generous and very humble. But he really didn't have a very strong conception of what a Catholic school was. And I had arrived at Chicago having been a Catholic school lay teacher in an Ursuline school. I went to an Ursuline school in New Rochelle, and one of my first jobs was teaching music in an Ursuline school in the Bronx, two very different institutions, but within the same tradition, not just Catholic, but run by the same order. And so as we were sort of talking and studying about this, and I was kind of fishing around for a topic, I talked at the time about different kinds of Catholic schools, and people didn't know what I was talking about. So I was asked to sort of, explain that, and how is it, and all the sort of things that you would look at, governance and finance and all of the sort of organizational features. So I did this, very elaborate picture of how they differed and so forth. I remember putting it on a board in a class, and Charles Bidwell, who was the chair of the department, but also the professor, was getting very, very excited about it because he didn't quite believe Coleman's findings, and maybe I had found something that Coleman hadn't looked at. It was almost competitive. But he finally turned to me, and it was a very formal guy, very nice too, but he turned and he said, "Well, Miss Driscoll, you have convinced us that there are differences, but so what? What do they mean?" And so I was really humming,
Right.
and I said,
I don't know.
There's a greater sense of community in some schools than others. There were parish schools, which were then pretty rare, big regional schools where kids were drawn from all over, and they had a different set of governance. And then the ones that I was familiar with, and my brothers had gone to, that were run by then actually, priests and brothers and sisters, but but within that tradition. And that tradition was very important to impart, and it gave a sense of shared value and history. And so shortly after that, Tony Bright came to the University of Chicago, and he had just written a book on Catholic schools.
Okay.
And so we worked together on this notion of school as community. What did it mean? How did we unpack it? So it became less about Catholic schools, in fact, really not about Catholic schools at all. But was it possible for a school to have shared values, a common agenda of activities, and one of the other pieces that we put in was an extended role for teachers that was more than just what they did in the classroom. And we used high school and beyond data, so we left out parents, which is always inexplicable to me now, except there wasn't any data on parents, so why fit it into your theoretical concept, right? But I think one of the things that in reviewing the literature on this and in the study and the work that I have done since on it, or did at that point in my career, it's a very interesting concept, because community, on the one hand, gives you a sense of identity, and you do share values, and you do have common interactions with other folks, and it's through that work or those interactions that you actually shape those values. But it was about that time that Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue, came out. And he talks a lot about overlapping communities and how we shape communities, but how they shape us.
Right.
And one of the things that you always have to talk about is, what are the boundaries and how permeable are they? Because boundaries keep people in, but they also keep people out.
Right.
And so it's been a concept that I think I've always struggled with intellectually. In all of the places that I've worked, whether it was in a professional organization like UCEA or the University of Illinois at Chicago or NYU or City College, I have always found some sort of professional community, some sort of like-mindedness. And I think I realized that that those things are very fragile, and they depend on relationships, and they depend on commitment, but they really do shape and give meaning to your work on a day-to-day basis. And, we're fortunate to the extent that we belong to more than one community and are shaped by more than one, set of comrades, if you will. I've also been interested, David Brooks, the New York Times writer, does sort of a popular gloss on a lot of the sociology work, and I think he's coined the term, but it might be somebody else, of a weaver. And that's a person that moves between communities. And I think now, at this stage of life, I think that's probably more important than anything. How do you have people that cross boundaries and bring people together and make communities more inclusive? I don't know if I've rambled on that, but that's sort of my take on community right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's all fascinating. I think it's all really relevant. And I think, and one of the interesting sort of places where I think so many of the members of UCA's, scholar community are in that, weaver space between PK-12 and higher ed. And I think, traditionally in my experience, like those are two very different, ecosystems almost, right? And the role that UCEA and again the scholars in our community can do is sort of weaving those two more closely together.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, I think UCA has been instrumental in that, but I also think the profession has changed dramatically since I went to graduate school in the early 80s, because then it was really very separate. And I think UCA and people like Paula Silver, for whom the Case Award was named, I never knew her, but I know her work. My colleague, the late Terry Astuto, David Clark, were very important in having UCA take the position that theory informs practice, and good practice informs theory.
Right.
And those two things have to be thought of hand in hand. And the real notion of a scholar practitioner is so central in that. And that it is, yes, we educate university professors, but we also work with people who have influence as practitioners in the field, as scholar practitioners. And there are many people that move between those two worlds,
Right.
much more. And I think we started to see that the sort of isolated, a lot of educational administration, as the field was called really came from, organization theory and sociology,
Right.
and it was quite dry and very much divorced from practice. And while I think those underpinnings are very important and they still enable us, especially as that work has evolved, to ask good questions that are theoretically driven as well, I think the respect and the inclusivity for the concerns of day-to-day practice and the unique nature of schools, they are in some ways like other organizations, but they're also, especially public schools, quite different. And understanding that became something that I think UCA really stood for and advanced through its scholarly journals, its presentations, and the people that were leading it, that were giving examples of what good scholarship looked like.
Right. Yeah, and I think and it's interesting because I think, one of the things that we're trying to do in these conversations is sort of, to something you said before, like how UCA shaped the field, how the field has shaped UCA, not just people in it, but the organization, and thinking about, how in many ways we move back and forth maybe between being an organization around PK-12 leadership and being a higher education organization that prepares faculty for future roles. And so I think, you're also kind of perfectly positioned to sort of to talk, to share your experiences about how these three things kind of go together. And
Yeah, and I see it very much as an evolution. I mean, the history of UCA, as you know, 70 years ago, was a pretty elite group of doctoral universities that were bonding together, in part because they wanted a group that respected their work in a way that they often weren't respected at the University of Chicago or Columbia Teachers College or NYU, right? And they were serious about that work and serious about high quality doctoral preparation and rigorous methodology, which at the time pretty much meant, exclusively quantitative, although, Chicago school methods did find their way into a lot of those dissertations. And then I think very much during the 80s and the 90s, the institution and the early 2000s really started to say, what is our mission, more broadly driven, both in terms of including institutions that are not Research One doctoral institutions, right? And that membership changed dramatically. But also, given that we still prepare a lot of superintendents and chief executive officers, as well as principals, especially through our master's programs, what is our role in this larger policy debate through the National Policy Board, which was a creation of UCA, that was bringing together the practitioner organizations, as well as, those representing higher education. And it was also very important that UCA was an institutional membership, which meant for you to be a member, you didn't sign up as an individual, your institution had to belong. And I think that the standards that were set for membership early on were very demanding but very influential in changing the profession. So that it demanded, X number of full-time faculty. People used to say 5, but I don't know. And I think that shifted over time, but it was the notion that, you didn't have diploma mills. You didn't have big places that were just sort of pulling things through. You had intense faculty work with the scholars who were doing, in this case, mostly doctoral work. But then there were very strong imperatives for diversification of the profession when it was almost exclusively white male. And the transformation in UCA and in institutions, and I'm still talking, first it was a couple of individuals of color, mostly male with the exception of like Barbara Jackson, and then more women. But I never had a woman professor when I was at the University of Chicago, and that was a very typical experience. You wouldn't know that you're looking at UCA today.
Right.
And UCA did a lot of things to embrace and support and promote diversity within institutions that were not so inclined to do that. And they did some very concerted efforts. There were things like the Barbara Jackson Scholars and those things, but long before that, it was one of the standards for membership. What were you doing to recruit and make more inclusive? Now, we can always do better. We can always go farther.
Right.
But I think that transformation has been very instructive in my own life. That is, if you're really looking to diversify a faculty, if you're really looking to have an institution be responsive and inclusive, it takes some tough work over time to make that happen, but it can happen.
Yeah. And I think it's also one of the reasons we wanted to talk to past presidents, because it's also the slow and steady work of leadership over time that have continued to sort of, carry the torch, I guess, so to speak, to the point.
And that's one of the wonderful things about being in leadership in an organization like this, because as in any sort of service, position, it's not about you. Right? It's about you with the context of the community of people that you're working with at the time, and what do you create. And each executive committee was a sort of a different mix and a different blend. And what the presidency was handed off to made a difference in terms of what happened. But it really is, it's not the creation. I mean, we've had some very strong executive directors, and I work closely with both Pat Forsyth and Michelle. And actually, I used to tell the story, the year I was president was the year, quite literally, of three popes. Pat Forsyth moved on to a university position. We had an interim, and we ran the search for Michelle. So I worked with three executive directors in that year.
Wow.
And obviously Michelle stuck around, so
Right.
had that problem until you.
That's true. And we had to look for a home too. So there's
Yeah.
always that.
Yeah. And that's also been a good thing, I think, about UCA, that each time you have a chance to reinvent yourself.
Right.
And reinvent yourself in the context of the institution you come to. And then, and it's not great for executive directors who are moving around. But I think it's very good for the institution.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm going to keep borrowing your language, because, when we were thinking, it was more around being a bridge, but I'm going to keep using your weaving language, because that appeals to me. But I think, in your role, and I think, again, sort of, looking back a little bit to when you were a faculty and member of UCA, but particularly in your role, you're weaving together many different groups of people, communities, perspectives, hopes and dreams, right? And in that work, what are some of the challenges that you find within higher ed? But then I guess maybe if you could speak to, between higher ed and K12.
When I went to City College, which is a great place, but, interesting in terms of the politics. And people would say to me, well, you're in leadership, and especially when I went into the provost position. What books have you read? To be either Dean of Education or this. And I said, Wolf Hall. And the reason I said that is because Thomas Cromwell, who's a very, difficult character in that, not anybody that you would want to necessarily emulate in terms of his particular values. But one of the leadership behaviors he engages in is he looks at the people that he's working with, and he tries to figure out in a given situation, what is it that they want? What is it that's important to them? Not what would he want if he were in that situation. And it's amazing when you look at some leaders, they can't make that shift.
Right.
And I think as a dean of education, or as a professor that was working in partnership when I was at NYU, again with my colleagues, with districts, it was very important to say what's important to the people that I'm working with in K-12.
Right.
What are they looking for out of this relationship? And what can we provide there? Not what makes sense for us to do, right? And you're always, Terry Astudio always used to say it was much harder to say yes than to say no. And it's absolutely true in any partnership. But I've found all of the successful partnerships that I've done either here as provost with different organizations or at City College, they start by saying yes and we'll figure it out.
Right.
We don't have to figure everything out at once, but we'll take it in the steps that we need to. When you move into university administration, it's funny, as a dean in education, you're more like a college president in that you're an advocate for your school. And if you're lucky, you get to be externally focused if you have the kind of infrastructure that allows you to know that you have good people working on the stuff day to day and that they're working with you. And that allows you to go out and sort of get new business or get grants or what thing. When you're a provost, you're again back in that weaving, brokering role, and you all of a sudden, you got to learn about engineering and architecture and medicine and nursing and all these different things.
Right.
But it's the same set of skills. It's basically how do we keep an institutional perspective? What does it look like at the enterprise level? And part of it is understanding what do people really need to do their work. And when you're in a complex organization, whether it's a school system or a university, the answer is usually not the same thing for everybody depending on the nature of the work that they do. Right? So, and sometimes that exposes inequalities and you got to take those on.
Right.
And sometimes, you just have to figure out what that means in terms of resource allocation. So it's an interesting intellectual problem.
Right.
Although it can make you crazy when you do it a budget.
Which I'm sure is true of PK-12 too, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the same thing when you're looking at different schools in an organization or what the high schools need versus the, in a district. And I think the other thing that K-12 administrators have to do, which I think we can learn from, is, and it's interesting when we look at what's happened in these congressional hearings, the ones who did the best were were not the college presidents.
Right.
It was the public school administrators because they're used to dealing with the public. That's an integral part of their job.
Right.
And if they're not serving the community and they're not communicating with the community, they can't get anything done. Right. And that's not just internal, not just the teachers, but the people who are sending their kids to school. So I think that's something we can all learn from at the university level.
Right. And I think, and I think you sort of also exposed a bit this interesting tension between advocacy and weaving and brokering, right? Because on the one hand, you're in care and concern for your community, and on the other hand, you have to be able to sort of negotiate and navigate broader issues and concerns, right? And I think that's just a fascinating to think about, both in higher ed and in PK-12, right? But even within UCEA.
It was interesting. UCA, when we were doing the cases project, when we were bringing the cases back, what became the Cases Journal, there had been UCA cases that were, just on paper. And so Ellen Goldring and Gary Crow and I went through all of those, and the project eventually became the Journal and Cases, and which, I'm very happy is still very much around. But the case methodology itself, which was sort of drawn from some of the business schools, is a really interesting methodology, and it's a good thing, teaching pedagogically, all of that. And great, I think, from the experience of a student, because you really are in a position where you have to encounter other people and their reading of the same material. But there used to be also these things, simulations that were in boxes. And so the idea was that you walked into your office and your girl, it would have been your girl, would have dumped all of this stuff on your in your inbox.
Right.
And so your job as an administrator was to go through it and figure out, what do you deal with first? What do you put for your girl in the outbox, and what do you pick up the phone, and what do you do? And there are days, I think, in these jobs where you think, I'm in an inbox. But, and my colleagues always think this is funny because I go back to this study, and actually when Herbert Simon talked to UCA, he cited this study of the million things that he had done when he gave I guess it was the Willower lecture a million years ago. But he did a study of experts and novices around what did they perceive and what did they see. And the methodologies, like circa 1956, was he brought a grand chess master, certified expert, into the room, and then somebody who just kind of knew how to play chess.
Right.
They saw the same chessboard, and then they were brought into another room and asked to reconstruct it. And you probably recollect, the experts did it in terms of potential moves.
Right.
And the other ones, it was sort of random. Because when the experts looked at it, they saw the chess book, they saw the chess board differently based on their experience. And I think the more experienced you become, not that you can't make a big mistake every day and pay for it,
Right.
but the more experienced you become in these positions, but especially in K12 administrative positions, the same stimulus for an experienced professional will be like, I have to react to that right away. Or that's really not as big a deal as you think it is.
Right.
And you learn that from other people and from your own experience. And I think it's gratifying to think that happens, but it never stops. It just never stops.
Right. I mean, I think just trying to shift this a little bit, because I think, higher ed has been, probably shifting and evolving the entire time you've been, in it. And so I'm curious as to your understandings about, what's shifted, what has changed, what has improved, and yeah, so that.
Well, if I were talking about our field, I would say, first of all, the who is in our field, both as students and as faculty, has changed tremendously. I mean, I kind of referenced that before. It is more diverse, it is more inclusive, which means you're bringing more voices to the table and you're getting different understandings. And so that means you're starting to look at different things. So that's been an evolution. It's not perfect, but it's dramatic when I go back and think of the classes that I sat in and the people that were being trained to be professors. And I remember I was up for a job at a university that shall not be named, which I did not get. And one of the gentlemen that was faculty said, we're looking at you as a diversity hire. And I said, if you could do that for a white woman from Scarsdale, hats off. Come on.
Right, right.
Yeah, I'm a different gender, but I'm not bringing you
Right.
like a different worldview here. So that's one thing. I also think that we have a much richer array of methodologies. And obviously, we have many different ways of thinking about work qualitatively. I was very fortunate at Chicago to work with both Philip Jackson and Dan Lordy, who were sort of leaders in that field early on. Phil's Life in Classrooms, which was really almost an anthropological study.
Right.
And the work that Dan did, which was a different kind of qualitative research, but the work on school teacher, and eventually he did on principles. And so, but I also think our ability to use quantitative methods that are more sophisticated and a little scary, because it's so much easier to do stuff without understanding what you're doing. But I think that's been a benefit in terms of getting at different kinds of relationships. And again, all of that needs to, evolve and change over time. And then I think that the last thing is that we, in higher ed, more generally, we kind of need to figure out what our place in the universe is. I think we're going through a very interesting time right now.
Right.
And watching a lot of missteps. But it's not just that, the value of higher ed is under fire as it gets more and more expensive. I think we really need to think about what is it we want out of a college or a university education. And to the extent that we restrict it, not acknowledge, but restrict it to job preparation, either writ large for, undergraduates, or even within the field even within our own field, we miss what I think has always been one of the great benefits of, good graduate and undergraduate education is you're introduced to things that are just happening, and you're getting a set of skills that 20 years down the road will help you change into something completely different. And so it's hard to balance those two because, again, the economic cost and therefore the economic value is very much on people's minds when they're going into debt and doing all of that. And, the good and the bad of that is the whole notion of student loans has made it so much more accessible for people, but it's created a generation of people that get out and say, I have to make money to do all of this. But at the same time, you want to be, if you're fortunate, you want to be in a place where it's not just thinking about the here and now, but what's next, what's happening, what's the thing that we're going to be talking about in 5 or 10 years. When we went back to those old cases, it was really amazing. 10 years, 15 years before there was special education law, so these were dating back to the 50s, there were cases there on what we would see as special education. There was also, believe it or not, one on a cross-dressing administrator. Now, this is like 1958.
Right.
And so you're sort of saying, the people that were really thinking about what was happening in schools were identifying things that didn't become sort of common issues or problems or things that people generally understood, for many years, but they kind of had their eye on that ball. Another one, one of the things that I think UCA was part of early on, how schools are financed, and the tremendous inequity of using the property tax system that we still can't fix.
Right.
And what a difference that makes in the day-to-day lives of students, depending on how your state chooses to pay for education.
Yeah, we still can't fix that one.
No.
And I think, I appreciate you kind of laying out some of the learnings in higher ed, but then also some of the challenges, right? Because, we are at a particular point in time still dealing with, COVID, still dealing with, sort of racial and unrest and reckoning and politics and the shrinking market, I guess, or the economic impact of all of that on universities, right? And so I'd love if you could, sort of noodle a bit on Enter UCEA, right, as an organization that lives in that context, who does work in PK-12, obviously, but who's, the air we breathe is more higher ed, and what you think some of the implications of all that might be for us.
Well, I think, as a scholarly community, we ought to be able, first of all, to model discourse, right? Because we don't see it a lot in our political communities right now. I mean, watching congressional hearings is like watching a food fight, I mean, even when I like the people, it's like, what? But I think, so I don't think that's a small thing, and I think we always took it for granted. And I think being able to do that in multiple ways, not just at a convention or in a scholarly debate, I mean, I think that's really important. I think it is important for our scholarly community to be vocal about the value and importance of education, period, and increasingly higher education. It's not just because it's our bread and butter. We sort of self-select into it because we like it or we see its value or whatever, but in most cases, it's an exceptional case where that's driven by, you know, boy, this is a great economic place to be in. I mean, how many of our professors are teaching either master's students or doctoral students that are making 2-3 times their salaries
Right.
as district administrators? They deserve it. But I think we have to talk about, so what is it that this community allows us to do? What are the benefits, not just to us personally, but benefits that accrue in helping to elevate the scholar practitioner within that K-12 community? We don't do a great job of supporting people once they finish our degrees, right? We're sort of not set up to do that. But when we're able to bring together policymakers, scholar practitioners, professors, graduate students into one space, it can be really extraordinary. And I think we should we should be trying to do more than that. More of that. I guess it's also important, you know, for us to be, I want to be fairly neutral on this, but I sure wasn't during the Trump administration. I'll just say that. I mean, there were claims and things that were made, they're being made now about higher education. And I think the degree to which we have broadened our understanding and recognized some of the things that should have changed, that we have been able to change, and the things that we haven't been able to change, that we're still trying, we should own that.
Right.
I mean, we should just own that. And, you know, it's funny, today, I don't know, I really don't know at what point I learned this. I know I didn't know it at the beginning of my career, and I have to be grateful to somebody to actually show me. But, you know, today I was reading something that a faculty member had written to a student, and it was about a grade and the person not getting the grade and so forth. And the letter talked about our high standards and how important it was for us to have high standards. And there was no recognition of what it felt like for that particular student to read that letter.
Right.
And I know I didn't worry about that at the beginning of my career. I was, you know, we're going to high standard. Right. And now, not just because I talked to the student, but I thought, oh God, you know, there's a point to be made here, and I'm not asking, in this case, I wasn't asking anybody to, you know, it was in the middle of appeal, change anything, but how you say it and how you realize what that person is experiencing is at the heart of what we do. It's not an add-on. And that goes for everybody. I mean, I'm just using the faculty student, but it's faculty to faculty, it's administrators to faculty, it's faculty to parents, it's all of that.
Yeah.
Am I wandering?
Oh my gosh, no, we don't wander, we think. But no, I mean, I think it sort of also brings me back to what we were talking about earlier about sort of like that, the role of faculty as individuals, but UCA as an institution, right? To sort of, to be both advocate and weaver. And how, you know, we learn about how best to do that from our students and our district and school partners. And then we also learn from our colleagues and administrators in higher ed.
And especially service with our colleagues. I mean, one of the things that UCA has done as a guild organization, which I think is great, is provide opportunities for you to work with other people on joint projects. And even smart people have to learn how to do that well. Right. You know, you have to learn, as director, you have to learn how to work with an executive committee. You have to learn how to work with a board. You have to learn how to deal with the plenum. You know, if you're reviewing something, you have to understand what does a good review look like? You know, what's actually going to be helpful for somebody. If you're doing a joint project or planning a program, you know, how do you get as many voices at the table as you can and have a coherent message? And how do you articulate that, and how do you defend it, and how do you listen to what people think about it? I mean, those are all things, they're good life skills.
Right.
But I have done a lot of work on high school boards and chaired a couple of them. but I think it was the work that I was doing, early on as a plenum rep, and then with different levels of, program involvement and stuff, and executive committee, even before president, that helped me learn how to do that and find enjoyment in it. I mean, service is always that thing you have to do, but it can be very enjoyable, and it's a wonderful opportunity to get out of your institution,
Right.
and then there's always service within your institution, but to sort of check where you are relative to everybody else and understand that, that thing that you thought was just in your department is kind of in every department,
Right.
or this thing that you thought was everywhere actually is something that's only in your school, So I
Yeah.
think that's a very important, for people that are putting their careers here, I think it's very important.
Right.
And more and more, I think more of our professors don't look like I did, which is somebody with very limited teaching experience and no administrative experience, who went right to, doctoral study in my 20s.
Right.
More and more people are bringing a much more substantial amount of practice experience as they go into their doctoral work. And so that's good for our profession as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a thoughtful, amazing conversation, and I know I could keep probing because I do see us as sort of sitting in this sort of you know you know privileged, I'm going to say, kind of position where we can both advocate and weave. And how do we maintain that and do it in ways that, to use some of your words, right, that are generous and humble and in service, not just to each other, but to the children in our schools, right? And so I'm equally inspired and like, oh my gosh, there's so much work left to be done. But the last question I will ask you, which is what we've been asking all of our past presidents, is, and you've talked a little bit about this already, and so, but the idea of like how UCA has shaped you.
I was involved with UCA my first job. I wasn't really at the University of Chicago, but it was the conference that one of my colleagues, Bob Crowson, said to me at UIC, you should go to this. And at that time, I mean, ARA is now huge.
Right.
But then it was much more, it was smaller, but it was still much more of a generalist conference. So, you would go and you would go to the 4 or 5 big talks, and they wouldn't necessarily be in your field. And then there was Division A and eventually the Division in Policy, but or any of the other ones. And so you had those sessions. But the thing about UCA was it was, what we would call our guild conference. Like everybody there was interested in the same stuff. And so you got an exposure not just to bigger ideas in the field generally, but bigger ideas in your particular area of work. I think ARA has lost a little bit of that as it's gone into, thousands of SIGs.
Right.
And so there's a little bit less of that shared experience and more. And I think that's a factor of it now being whatever it is, 10,000 people or something.
Right.
So people look for their own community. But UCA made good use of that by bringing in big speakers and, recognizing achievements with award and being very thoughtful about how that was structured. So, in the early days, that was always a big thing for me to go to the conference and spend time with colleagues, people largely from graduate school, or meeting friends of those folks, as we all ended up in different places. And it was also a place to sort of check how other people were shaping their careers. So I actually was over 20 years at NYU, but I've moved a couple of different times. And, when you go through that, it's sort of what kinds of things are you looking at and all of that sort of stuff. It was wonderful, and I did a lot of years on the Board of Educational Administration Quarterly. One of the things I always liked about that is you were reading, like, the latest stuff.
Right.
You were reading stuff before it was published, and so that was great, because you were, it was like getting the daily paper ahead of time, you were seeing stuff. And you built up, what do they used to call it, this invisible college in your head, right? That Fredo, I think it was Vito Perrone that used to use that. That was
Right.
like, these are the people that are kind of in my intellectual or my interest groups and stuff. again, I mentioned the opportunity to learn how to do service in professional organizations. But I think the other thing is I've just met wonderful people. And we were chatting a little bit about the people that you've talked to, and I enjoyed working with all of them. And, you know, back in the day when all of the executive committee meetings were in person and you flew to wherever 4 or 5 times a year, we could have a very difficult meeting or something that might be contentious or tension, but then you'd be with these people for dinner and you'd just laugh. And so there were wonderful friendships that really developed, and that's a rare and precious thing.
Yep, absolutely. Certainly precious and fragile,
Yeah.
which is where you have to keep working at all of those things and creating and continuing to create those opportunities for scholars that are new to the field and carving their path and as they go. So Mary, thank you so much for your time. I know
Well,
you're.
Monica, it's been delightful. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. I'm glad, and I can't wait to see you again sometime soon and continue our conversations around our thinkings about these things. So thank you so very, very much, and we will see each other soon, I hope.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Bye bye.